Chapter 24. During Luke and Cynthia's pool game, the three Wers had a chance to discuss their plans. Mr. Thatcher leaned forward. I don't know how long before Benedict will have legal access to the playground, but shutting it down was such a rushed affair. I feel it's most important to get in there and make sure there are no problems. That could prove disastrous. It hasn't been that long since the crews left, Giselle said. It's probably okay. But I understand what Mr. Thatcher means, Bryce said. This is a situation where a little problem could turn into a big one really fast. I really want to take a look at the place, but I just agreed to stay with Cynthia tonight. She offered, and turning her down would seem strange to her after all this. You're staying with Cynthia? Giselle pinned him with a look. Are you involved with her after all? He sighed. Not only do you know that I'm not interested in her like that, but it seems that your fascination with Luke is the real problem here. Giselle recognized that he'd made a direct hit. You're right. Sorry. Cynthia and I are that rare phenomenon, heterosexual friends of opposite genders. A hint of vulnerability flickered in his blue eyes. And if you must. No, I can't seem to forget Miranda. Giselle felt sorry for him, but he'd done it to himself and she didn't want to give him false hope. I'm in no position to comment, but you will. She hesitated, but she was his sister after all, and sisters were obligated to say the hard things to brothers. You really screwed up that relationship. I don't know if you can ever salvage it. He nodded. I realize that. But she hasn't hooked up with anyone else yet. Checked. Giselle didn't know if that meant he was willing to return and move into the alpha role or not. She emptied her mind of all expectations as she turned to him and asked. He put his hand over hers. I've done a lot of soul-searching in the weeks I've been gone. I had to get some perspective on the situation before I could decide if it was what I wanted, or what everyone else wanted for me. Before you tell me your decision, let me say that I'll support you whatever it might be. He grinned at her. Picked up a few tips from the Luke and Cynthia mess, did you? Yes. Good. So have I. What I learned about myself is that family is important to me too. And tradition. I'm ready to be the alpha. Giselle took a deep breath and sandwiched his hand between both of hers. I'm happy that you decided that. Selfishly I wanted you to, but I meant what I said. I would have been behind you either way. That's terrific to hear. He hesitated. And if Miranda can ever forgive me, I want her to be by my side. It's encouraging that she hasn't found another, Mr. Thatcher said. For both your sakes, I'll hold a good thought. Thanks. Bryce glanced at the butler. As I started to say before, I can probably still go with you tonight. I'm sleeping in a spare room, so if I'm careful, Cynthia doesn't have to know I'm gone. Giselle shook her head. I wouldn't risk it, Bryce. I'm scheduled to meet Benedict at precisely 2, Mr. Thatcher said. We won't be able to wait for you. I understand. If I think there's any chance Cynthia would catch me, I won't do it. He looked over at Giselle. Sure you won't come with us? I'd like to, but I can't. I know. Just teasing you. Enjoy your last hurrah. Right. Heat rose in her cheeks. He would have to say something in front of Mr. Thatcher. But she also realized he'd kept his comment relatively tame. He could have made it 10 times more suggestive. As luck would have it, Cynthia and Luke returned to the table before she'd regained her composure. Luke looked at her and raised his eyebrows. She fanned her face. Bryce and his jokes. My brother knows how to make me blush. It's a talent. Bryce stretched his arms over his head. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm ready to call it a night. Mr. Thatcher pushed back his chair. So am I. But I've certainly enjoyed the evening. You and I will do this again sometime, Luke said. Maybe not in this particular setting, though. I expect to be persona non grata around here very soon. Bryce stood. You might be more welcome than you think. I have a hunch. Benedict Cartwright will be happy to have you as an honored customer after you turn over the deed. He might at that. Giselle liked the idea of her brother being a key player in potentially ending the feud between the Cartwrights and the Daltons. His time in Vegas had turned out to be more valuable than she ever would have dreamed. I just had an idea, although I don't know if Benedict will go along with it. What if Vaughn thinks Benedict talked me into selling the moon back to him? Would that get him out of the doghouse and restore some family harmony? That's a compassionate plan, Giselle said. It's worth a try. But she had a sudden image of a wolf in a doghouse and she made the mistake of looking at Bryce. Judging from the sparkle in his green eyes, he'd thought the same thing. She quickly glanced away and pressed her lips together, laughing at this private joke would be a very bad idea. She would have loved to share the joke with Luke, but she couldn't, and that made her sad. They'd become close in so many ways, yet they still were separated by an enormous gulf. Her heart longed to bridge that chasm and be one with him in all ways, but that was selfish thinking. I guess we're all ready to leave then. Luke took out his wallet and left several bills on the table. Hey, are we paying? Bryce reached in his hip pocket for his wallet. I assumed it was on the house, but I'll toss in something if it's not. The drinks are free, but the server still needs her tips. Got it. Bryce threw more money on top of Luke's already large tip. She didn't have much business tonight, so this should help. Giselle smiled. Luke and her brother had a similar generosity of spirit. She thought about it, she might find other traits they had in common. Mentally listing them and imagining a friendship between the two was a pointless exercise, though. She took out some money she'd tucked in the pocket of her jeans before she'd walked over there and added it to the pile on the table. Goodness, I can see where this is headed. Cynthia dug out some crumpled bills and put them on top of the growing stash. I'm not about to be the cheapskate in the bunch. Nor am I. Mr. Thatcher produced a crisp $100 bill and balanced it carefully on the mound of cash. Cynthia let out a whoop. Way to trump us all, Mr. Thatcher. The butler smiled. I always take pleasure in tipping well. Shall we go? As before, Mr. Thatcher led the way back to the Silver Crescent service entrance as if he were the patriarch of the group. For the most part he filled the role beautifully, but he wasn't a big picture kind of guy. He'd focused on the immediate problem, Luke's unhappiness when Giselle left in the morning. He'd serve Luke far better by visualizing the disastrous long-term effects if she brought Luke into her world. The cheerful group piled on the private elevator together. Mr. Thatcher got off on his floor, and a quick glance passed between him and Bryce before the doors slid closed. When Bryce and Cynthia got off, Bryce winked at Giselle, and true to form she blushed. They beat the cleaning crew up to the suite. Luke tucked his arm around her waist and pulled her close. I know they did. She gazed up at him. Bryce is threatening to blackmail me with the pictures on his phone. Luke grinned. I trust you have your own blackmail material stored somewhere? Absolutely. He won't show those pictures to anyone, especially if he wants to get back with Miranda. I'll be a key player in that effort. He won't mess with me. The doors opened, and he kept his arm around her waist as they walked toward the double doors of the suite. I doubt anyone messes with you, Harley girl. Which reminds me, you never showed me how to ride that hog. She looked into blue eyes filled with warmth and regret. Anyone can teach you. If you buy one, they'll be happy to arrange for lessons. You'll pick it up in no time. You know I won't do that, he said softly, holding her gaze. Every time I got on the damn thing I'd think of you. Her throat tightened. Hey, I'm sorry. I swore I wouldn't get all mushy and sentimental tonight, and now I've made you look very sad. I am sad, she said in a husky voice. Not for long. He tightened his grip around her waist and smiled. Come with me, little girl. The big bad wolf is going to eat you up. It was the wrong teasing remark, and the tears she'd vowed not to cry began to fall. Well, damn. He hustled her through the double doors. I thought that might make you laugh, but apparently not. She covered her face with both hands. I'll be okay. She choked back a sob. Give me a minute. I'd give you the rest of my life if I could. He gathered her close. And I didn't plan to say that either. His words only made her cry harder. What a fool she'd been to think she could have a fun romp with this funny, gorgeous, generous, stubborn, and thoroughly lovable man. I'll bet you wish you'd never started this. He nestled her head against his broad chest and rubbed her back. No. Her voice was clogged with tears. I'm glad we've had this. She took a shaky breath. It's just. Yeah, it's always tough when the party's over. Are you sorry? Hell no. I've always figured you'd leave. There was a point when I thought. Well, it doesn't matter. He leaned down and rested his cheek on her hair. But you're not gone yet. I vote we make the most of the time we have left. She gave a watery chuckle. As opposed to having me cry the whole blessed time. Something like that. Unless Bryce and Cynthia told you to as a final way to get me wet. Oh, Luke. She was half laughing and half crying, but that was better than totally crying. She drew back and swiped at her eyes. Can I interest you in a trip to the bedroom? He gazed down at her. You can, but I have no idea what we'll find there. You recall I ordered a cleaning crew, not a housekeeper. They might have stripped the bed and left with the evidence. At least it won't be a leaky water bed. Good point. He hooked an arm around her shoulders. Let's go investigate our options. When they reached the bedroom, Giselle's tears gave way to helpless laughter. Luke released her to go stand at the foot of the bed and stare in disbelief. It's the same. Still effing white. Giselle stifled her giggles. If you didn't tell them not to, then. But you'd think, after seeing that god-awful mess we made, they'd have asked me if I wanted to keep everything the same. He glanced at her. Wouldn't you have asked me if you were them? Maybe they tried. Oh. He pulled his phone out of his coat pocket and grimaced. 3 messages. I didn't hear my phone. Did you hear my phone? She shook her head. But I wasn't listening for a phone. I was involved in other things. He looked up from his phone and his gaze locked with hers. Me too. Maintaining eye contact, he shoved his phone back in his pocket as he walked back to her. And I intend to be involved with those things again. Who gives a damn what color the bedding is? I don't. Neither do I. He cupped her face in both hands and leaned down. We'll be too busy to notice. And he kissed her with the certainty of a man who knew that his passion was returned. They undressed each other this time, and it didn't take long. Soon they were rolling naked on the pristine white sheets. They stroked and fondled with the confidence of lovers who've learned which caresses bring the most pleasure. Giselle banished melancholy thoughts as she reveled in the wonder of loving and being loved by Luke. Sex between them had been good from the beginning, but it had grown richer with each encounter. Tonight she treasured every moment as they writhed on the bed. Skin to skin, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. At last they sought the deepest connection, the one they craved most of all. Each thrust, each tremor, each moan brought them closer to total surrender. Giselle's body gathered itself. Poised for the coming explosion, she looked up into eyes blazing with the same fire burning within her. She could no longer hold back her truth. I love you, Luke Dalton. He drew in a quick breath. Ah, Giselle. His eyes darkened. I know you do. No. And he drove home with a triumphant cry, the moment of his orgasm matching hers. They held on tight and rode the whirlwind. Long after the storm subsided, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms. She would have loved to drift off to sleep that way, but her mind was filled with thoughts of leaving. Sleep wouldn't come. The thought of never seeing Luke again tore her apart. In spite of all her misgivings, she wanted to be with him. Mr. Thatcher thought they belonged together. Bryce thought they belonged together. She trusted their insights, but what if they were wrong? What if she revealed her secret and Luke was thoroughly repulsed? Was it better to leave when he still thought of her as the woman who got away? Besides, if she gambled on him accepting her werewolf nature and lost, they wouldn't have a future, but he'd be stuck with guarding the secret for the rest of his life. What should she do? Giselle. His voice was low and intense. I can almost hear you thinking. Please tell me you're reconsidering. I thought you were asleep. How could I sleep with all that thinking going on? Oh, Luke. I don't know what to do. I do. He sat up. Stop resisting and say we can be together. Tell me this awful secret, whatever it is. She gulped. Once I do, there's no turning back. There's no turning back anyway. Like the song says, I will always love you. Couldn't stop doing that if I tried. He blew out a breath. Just tell me what it is. How bad can it be? Life-changing. Okay. He got out of bed and began to pace. Mr. Thatcher and Bryce are involved, aren't they? Yes. I knew it. And somehow it all ties into the security at Illusions. You don't have to say yes or no. I don't know how, but it does. She trembled. Sitting up seemed like a better way to face this decision, so she did that. Then she decided to get out of bed, too. He whirled to face her. I love you. He practically shouted it. Don't shut me out, Giselle. Tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I swear I can deal with. Nothing's more important to me than being with you. Nothing. She could barely breathe as fear tightened her chest. But in spite of the fear, she made a decision. She would tell him. She wanted him and he wanted her, and maybe Bryce was right. Luke needed a chance to accept or reject her as she really was. She would take full responsibility for the outcome, but he deserved to know the truth. He faced her, eyes flashing. Well? Are you going to tell me? Yes. She gulped for air. Her pulse raced, sending liquid fire through her veins. I'm a werewolf. Chapter 25. Luke went completely still. Then, because it was the only logical response, he laughed. That's a great line, but your timing is lousy. I'm not in the mood for joking around, Giselle. Except her expression was completely serious, which made him nervous. I'm not joking. I realize that's a shocking thing to hear, but it's the truth. He stared at her. Until now, he'd considered her the love of his life. And she was batshit crazy. That wasn't a politically correct description anymore. He didn't know what was PC these days to label someone who was a taco short of a Mexican combo plate. Sad to say, he still loved her, crazy or not. But she needed help. Giselle, is there a medication you might have skipped recently? We've been so busy that you easily could have forgotten. Is it in your suitcase? I'd be happy to. I'm not on medication and don't need to be. Oh boy. He'd heard of cases like this where the patient became belligerent. I'll get Bryce. I'll call Cynthia and tell her to send Bryce down here. I'm sure he knows what. Don't get Bryce. Keep this between you and me for now, please. Okay, no, Bryce. You and I will handle this together. He tried to stay calm. How about taking a nice little ride with me? There's a 24-hour clinic within a few minutes of here. You don't have to be scared or anything. I'll stay with you the whole time. She sighed. Luke, you're a really good guy. You think I'm psychotic, don't you? That's such a harsh word. You're a little confused about reality, but we can fix that. How about getting dressed? That's a good start. And he'd been so sure that he knew her. Was it possible that she was telling the truth? No, not possible. She had a chemical imbalance and he would get her some help for that. I guess there's only one way to convince you. Dropping to her hands and knees, she stretched out naked on the bedroom carpet, facing him. This isn't a good time for sex. I never thought I'd hear myself say that concerning you, but I have my standards. Taking advantage of a disturbed woman is not my idea of acceptable behavior, so if you'll just get up and put on your... He lost track of what he'd been about to say when she began to sparkle. Okay, this was freaking him out. Normal women didn't sparkle. He'd seen a vampire movie that involved sparkling, but Giselle hadn't announced she was a vampire. She'd said she was a werewolf. He didn't believe in vampires or werewolves, so this couldn't be happening. A nightmare. He was having a nightmare. He pinched himself though, and it hurt. Wasn't that the test? He'd love to wake up and find out he was dreaming, and his beloved was still in bed with him instead of lying on his bedroom carpet, sparkling. That wasn't all she was doing though. Along with the pretty lights, she was changing right before his eyes. He rubbed them, thinking that he was hallucinating. Maybe he was the one in need of medication. Or a good bottle of scotch. Damnation. The dancing lights faded, and where a red-headed woman with green eyes had been a wolf now stood. Its coat was a deep red, very close in color to Giselle's hair, and its eyes, although they were those of a wolf, were emerald green. He began to shake, and his heart was beating double time. His voice was a mere whisper. Giselle. The wolf looked at him, intelligence shining in its green eyes. In her green eyes, he couldn't deny the evidence. This wolf was Giselle, and Giselle was this wolf. His brain hurt, but she told him the truth. He dragged air into his lungs. Okay. He still wasn't registering this. He blew out that same air. Okay. I need to think about this. In my wildest dreams, I never. He started grabbing his clothes. Let me think. I need to talk a walk. Please don't go anywhere. He pulled on his clothes as the wolf watched him. Just let me have a little time to sort this out. To adjust. I'll be back. Don't leave. Shoving his feet into loafers, he grabbed his jacket and his keys and headed out, his brain spinning like a carnival ride. and he'd thought she was crazy. That would have been easier to take. In the elevator, he braced his hands against his knees as if he'd run a marathon. He started to punch the button for the garage, changed his mind and chose the first floor instead. Driving in his condition, total freakout mode was not a good idea. Ducking out the service door, he started walking, unsure of his destination. He didn't know what time it was, but probably late. The moon was closed down for the night. That's where he'd go. He could sit alone in the bar, which still belonged to him. He could pour himself a stiff scotch, which he really could use right now, and he could think what the hell he was going to do next. Having a key to the bar in his possession had been a matter of pride. He'd learned the code to the alarm system for the same reason. This property was his, and he'd like knowing he could go inside whenever he wanted. Like now. Moments later, he was rummaging behind the bar for the best bottle of scotch in the house. After he located that, he grabbed a glass and walked over to a table. He deliberately didn't choose the one where he'd so recently sat with Giselle. That little gathering seemed like it had happened years ago. A werewolf. She'd warned him that her secret would be life-changing. No. Shit. After pouring himself a glass of scotch, he took a hefty gulp. He didn't plan to get drunk, but he wouldn't mind a little Dutch courage. He'd need it when he went back to the penthouse, which he would do, and soon. She might be a werewolf, but he loved her. If you loved someone, you accepted them, warts and all. Except this was a little more significant than a wart. The clock behind the bar registered 2:30 in the morning. His life had changed forever about 20 minutes ago. For some reason he thought he should remember the time and date that his entire worldview changed. Now that the initial shock was past, he had a million questions. All he knew about werewolves came from Hollywood, and they usually got that stuff wrong. He hoped they got it wrong. Otherwise he might need a lot more scotch. He'd nearly finished his first glass and was debating whether to pour a second, when he heard a noise. No, not just a noise. Voices. They came from the hallway that led to the restrooms and the kitchen. Good God, was he about to start hearing voices now? Or seeing ghosts? More likely, he was lucky enough to be here when somebody was breaking into the place. That would cap his evening off nicely. Screwing the top on the bottle of scotch, he took it with him as a potential weapon and started down the hall. Yeah, this was weird. The sound of male voices came closer, but not from either of the bathrooms or the kitchen, which would be logical if someone was messing around in here. The voices came from behind the wall at the end of the hallway. Although the conversation was muffled, Luke thought there were at least 2 guys, maybe 3. Standing there waiting to see what happened might not be the wisest course of action since he was outnumbered. But after watching Giselle turn into a wolf and then downing a glass of scotch, Luke was in a what the hell mood. If ghosts walked through that wall and came toward him, and at this point anything was possible, he would hightail it out of there. Even if he threw the bottle of scotch, it wouldn't stop a ghost. Whoever was behind that wall, they were about to run smack into it if they were real people. Then he heard a familiar accent. A familiar British accent. Mr. Thatcher? He thought the night couldn't get any weirder until the wall started moving. While he stared, no doubt with his eyes bugging out of his head like a cartoon character, the wall swiveled, allowing 3 men to walk through the opening. Yikes! Bryce stopped short, and the 2 behind him, Mr. Thatcher and Benedict Cartwright, plowed into Bryce. For a moment, the hallway was silent except for the sound of everyone gulping for air. Luke found his voice first. What in damnation is going on? The 3 men looked at one another as if each hoped that one of the others would come up with a good story. Luke tried again. Where did you come from? What's behind that wall? Bryce swallowed. Well, it's complicated. Luke studied Bryce, whose coloring was very close to Giselle's. Same basic genetics, which meant he mentally slapped his forehead. She'd said that Bryce would support her story of being a werewolf. Perhaps we should all sit down, Mr. Thatcher said. Not yet. Luke focused on Bryce and decided to try some fishing. I know. About your sister, Landry. His eyes narrowed. Who told you? She did. When? About 30 minutes ago. And I figure since you 2 are related. Where is she? Right here. Luke turned to find Giselle standing behind him. The Giselle he'd first met. Long-legged, gorgeous redhead in jeans, boots, a sweater, and a leather jacket. You didn't lock the front door, she said. I had a hunch you might be in here. She glanced at the bottle of scotch. Drowning your sorrows? No. Celebrating the fact that I finally know what's going on with you. He gestured at the three men standing at the end of the hall. And I'll take a wild guess that you're all the same species. He fixed his gaze on Mr. Thatcher. Including my butler. Giselle glanced at Bryce. You suggested that I tell him, so I did. I even put on a demonstration, after which he ran out of the suite as if his tail was on fire. I did not. Luke frowned. It was a shock. I had to be alone for a little while. Giselle held his gaze. Alone except for a bottle of scotch. That doesn't reassure me as to your state of mind about all this. He saw bravado in her green eyes, but it was hiding a layer of hurt. I'm sorry. I should have stayed. Cut the guy some slack, sis. Bryce walked forward and hooked an arm around Luke's shoulders. Give him some time to get used to the idea. It's not every day that a man finds out he's in love with a werewolf. A gasp of surprise made them all freeze. With a soft oath, Giselle whirled around as Cynthia walked toward them. Where did you come from? I didn't hear you. I was back in the corner listening. I went up to the penthouse to tell Luke that Bryce was gone, and I took the fire stairs like I always do. I saw Luke charge into the elevator. He looked upset, so I followed him. When he came in here, I slipped in behind him. I was ready to say something, but then he grabbed the scotch, which told me he wanted to be alone. I tucked myself into a corner, not sure what to do. She paused for breath. A werewolf, Giselle? Really? Luke groaned. It's a joke. I seriously doubt that, big brother. Cynthia crossed her arms. And I'm not leaving, so you might as well fill me in. Nobody's leaving. Benedict Cartwright stepped forward for the first time. We obviously have a major security breach. He pulled out his phone. I can have a Cartwright security team here in 5 minutes, or... He paused to glance around the group. We can all sit down, have a drink, and figure this out among ourselves. I choose option 2, Bryce said. Anybody else want to voice an opinion? Definitely option 2, Luke said. Don't call anybody Cartwright. He glanced around at the assembled group. Let's have a seat in the bar. Drinks are on the house. And I'm mixing 'em, Benedict said. You may be a better poker player, but I'm a hell of a lot better at bartending. Luke looked him in the eye. That's for sure, Cartwright. You belong here and I don't. I'm going to sell this place back to you. I finally figured out that was the only sensible thing to do, with a little help from my friends. Benedict almost smiled at that. It's good to have friends. Giselle had held it together so far, and she was a pro at presenting a calm facade, but she couldn't guarantee how long she could keep it up. She'd risked everything to reveal her were being, and Luke had run out on her. Bryce had told her to give Luke some time to get used to the idea, but what if he never did? As everyone left the hallway, bound for a table in the bar, she stayed behind. So did he. He came toward her, and she tried to gauge his expression, but her darned eyes kept tearing up and she had to blink the moisture away. Giselle. Yeah. Please forgive me for running out on you like that. She sniffed. It's okay. Close up. She could see from the look in his eyes he was sorry. My brother's right. It's a shock to hear it, and I. So you do forgive me? She nodded. Thank God. He cupped her face in both hands, touching her for the first time since he'd watched her shift. Because I love you so much. He brushed at her damp cheeks with his thumbs. And I feel like an ass for hurting you and making you cry. She swallowed. You don't have to say you love me to make me feel better. I'm not who you thought or what you thought. This doesn't work for you then. I'll. He cut her off with a kiss. A tender kiss that she would cherish forever, no matter what happened. Then he lifted his head. We have lots to talk about. I have lots to learn. But never doubt that I love you with all my heart. She gazed into his eyes and knew that it was true. They would love each other forever. But that didn't mean they'd be together forever. She sensed he was reserving judgment on that. She couldn't blame him. He had no idea what he was getting into. Let's go in and have Cartwright mix us a drink. With an encouraging smile. He laced his fingers through hers as they walked out of the hallway. He kept her hand tucked in his as they ordered drinks at the bar and walked over to the spot where the others had pushed a couple of tables together. He made sure they sat close together, and his firm grip reassured her that he wasn't repulsed by what he'd seen when she shifted. He just needed to know more, which was fair. As they sat down, Cynthia was busy peppering Bryce with questions. Luke probably had as well, but she knew he'd have some personal ones that he wouldn't ask in mixed company. In the meantime, Bryce was doing a bang-up job of correcting Cynthia's misperceptions about werewolves and possibly Luke's as well. She leaned toward Bryce. Can you see better than a human? Not during the day, but my wolf night vision is awesome. Cynthia appeared transfixed by that notion. Do you hunt? No. Yuck. Is that just your preference? Because I can sort of picture you. None of us hunt, at least not in modern times. Centuries ago that might have made sense, but now it's a lot less work to go to the store and buy the food. But you could hunt if you wanted to. Bryce shook his head. I'd be terrible at it. I'd have to be taught, and since nobody hunts anymore, the skill has died out. I'll bet if you were really hungry and... Hey sis, can we drop the subject? Luke flicked a glance at Giselle. She was a bloodthirsty little kid. Loved gory movies. Still do. Cynthia laughed. While you, on the other hand, are the biggest wimp on the planet. I'd look over at you and you'd be all hunched down and not watching. Giselle smiled at him. I'm the same way. Been teased about it all my life. A round of drinks coming up. Benedict appeared with 6 glasses on a tray and dispersed them before pulling up his own chair. So how's the discussion progressing? Let's see. Bryce held up one hand and ticked off the subjects. We've talked about the political structure of werewolf packs. And you're going to be the Landry Alpha, Bryce. Cynthia picked up her Cosmo. That's super cool. Ah, Luke said. So the Alpha is the equivalent of a CEO. Bryce will be the CEO, Giselle said. And the Alpha. Vaughn's the Alpha for the Cartwrights. Cynthia glanced over at Luke. Remember how we talked about the suspicious nature of the security at Illusions? You couldn't get in the lobby because you're not the right species. It's a werewolf-only hotel. Luke nodded. It's all beginning to make sense to me now. The Silver Crescent used to be a werewolf hotel, didn't it? Yep. Benedict sipped his drink. You can't imagine how long the renovations took. Thus the stalling on signing over the deed. Luke sighed. That paints your father in a whole new light. I'm a little worried about this security breach, Benedict said. But it's kind of nice to be able to set the record straight. My dad made a mistake betting the Silver Crescent, but he wasn't trying to drive your dad crazy. He had a work community to protect. You don't have to worry about the security breach, Cynthia said. You can trust Luke and me. Right, Luke? Yes. He squeezed Giselle's hand. I'll guard this secret with my life. Whoa. Bryce looked impressed. I like the sound of that, Dalton. I think you'll be just fine. So will I. Cynthia glanced around at the group. I'm sitting with my new friend Bryce, my childhood friend Benedict, my second father Mr. Thatcher, and Giselle the woman, or were, whichever I'm supposed to say, my brothers in love with. All of you are very important to me. I'll do the protecting with my life. Thing too. That shouldn't ever be necessary, Benedict said. But thanks. The council will be glad to hear it. Council. Luke's grip on Giselle's hand tightened. The War Council, she said. They'll have to review the situation and determine what's the best course of action. He looked at her, his gaze wary. Meaning what? Depending on their evaluation of your trustworthiness, you might just be monitored for a brief time. Yeah, but you don't have to worry about it, Bryce said. Giselle's on the council. Besides that, Cynthia said, Bryce was telling me before when you and Giselle were kissing in the hallway, that if you mate with her, you'll be totally accepted. And once I pass the trustworthiness test, which I so totally will, then I'll be accepted too because I'm your sister. She smiled at them. Across the table. See how this is all working out for the best. Giselle stifled a groan. She just dealt with a brother who'd balked because he felt railroaded into a situation. She couldn't imagine Luke being overjoyed about the corner he'd just discovered himself in either. Chapter 26. Luke felt Giselle tense, and he could guess why. She didn't want him to feel manipulated into something before he even understood it. Most of all, she wouldn't want him to think everyone was pushing him into a relationship that involved a lifetime commitment. That lack of choice was the very thing that had driven her brother to take a long Vegas vacation. But Luke didn't feel manipulated, even though Cynthia had made it clear what she thought should happen. Instead he felt challenged, and in a good way. Giselle might have different DNA from his, but the more he thought about it, the more that fascinated him. As for the world she lived in, he understood it better than she might think. It was the world of commerce, the world he'd grown up in and been trained for. The Cartwrights and the Landrys might each be a werewolf pack, but they were business-oriented and apparently successful at it. No wonder his father and Harrison had become friends. Except for the werewolf thing, they had led similar lives. He was beginning to see a grand new adventure spreading out before him, and that was exciting. If he could share that adventure with Giselle, the most fascinating female he'd ever known, he would be a happy man. Being accepted into her circle sounded great to him. He wasn't clear on what the deal would be with kids in that scenario, but she'd said she couldn't get pregnant, so that might not be an issue. So far, though, nobody had bothered to explain a more immediate mystery, so he decided to ask the obvious question. What were you three werewolves doing behind that revolving door? Benedict grinned. I wondered when you'd get around to that. Well, I just did. Care to explain? Especially since I still own this bar, and that means I own the revolving door, and probably whatever's behind it. I'd be happy to tell you, Benedict said. In fact, this is going to make my life a whole lot easier. Luke gestured across the table. Proceed. Benedict launched into an explanation that sounded almost as unbelievable as the existence of werewolves. Luke found himself glancing down at the floor. Beneath his feet was something he never would have imagined in a million years. Cynthia's eyes widened. All that stuff is underground? And no one knows? The werewolves know, Benedict said. I can't believe the secret hasn't gotten out. Luke continued to wrestle with the concept. Somebody hears a rumor and somehow gets past security to check it out. In human form, everybody looks the same. Yes, but they don't smell the same, Giselle said. I knew the minute Mr. Thatcher walked into your suite that he was were. And vice versa. So a human wouldn't pass the sniff test? Is that what you're saying? Benedict nodded. That's the time-honored way we tell wers from humans. Because you're right. Any human walking in here right now wouldn't have any idea we're from a different species. Well, obviously I want to see this place. Luke finished his drink. Shall we go? Me too. Cynthia swigged the last of her Cosmo. I wish I could see it all. Working, though, with the stream and the waterfalls in operation and the forest sounds and the moon. I think the moon is genius considering the name of the bar. Bryce looked over at Benedict. Can you see any reason not to turn on the water? We fixed that small leak. It would be good to test the system, though, and make sure everything's working right if the playground will open again soon. Benedict's gaze registered approval. Good thinking, Landry. And for the record, I appreciate your help and friendship over the past few days. Glad to be of service. How about turning on the lights and sound system? Cynthia asked. I'd love to get the full effect. Bryce turned toward Luke. It'll run up your utility bill, man. And you're the one on the hook for that until you sell the moon to this dude. He angled his head toward Benedict. What the hell? Luke shrugged. My little sister wants to see the show. He glanced over at Giselle and smiled. So do I, come to think of it. Cynthia left her chair and came over to kiss his cheek. Thanks, bro. The controls are in the locker room, Benedict said. Follow me. I want to see how you activate everything, Bryce said. Cynthia headed off right behind them. I knew you two were cool, but I had no idea how cool. Luke caught Giselle gazing after Cynthia with a flicker of concern in her eyes. He shared that concern. Cynthia might think this werewolf stuff was fascinating and cool, but knowledge of it would have a cost. He wanted to know what that was. He looked over at Mr. Thatcher, who was finishing his gin and tonic. We need to talk. Cynthia popped back in the room. Aren't you all coming? I thought you wanted to see this, Luke. I do. You go ahead and get things started. I'll wait here with Mr. Thatcher until you say it's ready for viewing. Same here, Giselle said. Come and get us when it's all at its spectacular best. Don't worry. Cynthia flashed them a smile. I will. Once she was gone, Mr. Thatcher squared his shoulders as if preparing for a blow. If you choose to fire me, sir, I completely understand. I'm not going to fire you, Mr. Thatcher, But I need to know from you and Giselle what happens next. I run a large business, and when we have a security issue we fix it. I've heard a little about a council and some monitoring, but that seems too simplistic and easy. What's the real scoop? Giselle put a hand on his arm. You and Cynthia are in no danger. Promise you that? Certainly not. Mr. Thatcher looked horrified at the idea. I would lay down my life for you and Cynthia. Not that it will be necessary, he added quickly. That's what I need to know. Luke fought to stay calm. Personally, I can take care of myself, but if anyone plans to harm my sister, there will be hell to pay. They won't, Giselle said. You have my word. He turned to her and found love and certainty in those green eyes. He was vastly reassured. Then if we're not going to be killed, how will you deal with us? We know the secret. Surely we're considered a security risk. That's right. She met his gaze without hesitation. That's why I was so determined that you wouldn't ever know. But then Bryce said something to me that I wasn't able to forget. He said if I never told you, I was taking away your ability to choose whether you wanted to be with me or not. Thank God for Bryce. He gave her hand a squeeze. He was right. And I'm fine with whatever has to go on with me. Cynthia I worry about. I know I'm not her parent, but this is different. She was swept up in this by accident, and I want to make sure she'll be safe. She will be. We'll work through it together. Great. Just tell me how. I'm not sure yet. Mr. Thatcher cleared his throat. If I may offer some thoughts. Luke glanced over at the man. No, the werewolf. He'd considered a second father. To think he'd always considered Mr. Thatcher a little on the dull side. Please do, he said. I'm counting on you to help me sort this out. I haven't had much time to ponder this, but one thing I know, you and Cynthia are completely trustworthy. I've watched you both grow into adults who keep your word. So that's all I'll have to do? Promise not to tell? I find that hard to believe. It'll be more complicated than that, Giselle said. But having 3 werewolves vouch for your character will go a long way with the council. Not as if you're the first 2 humans to find out about us, and we've managed to keep the secret for centuries. This council has sole discretion to decide what's to be done with us. Luke didn't appreciate having his fate or Cynthia's in the hands of others, especially a different species from his own. That makes it sound like some kind of kangaroo court, Giselle said. It's not. It's a reasonable group. And as Cynthia said, I'm on it. That could make a difference. I hope. Unless you're going to be in trouble for revealing the secret to me, and by accident to Cynthia. He gazed at her. I'll say it was all my fault. I hounded you until you told me. No. Mr. Thatcher waved both hands. Don't do that. If anyone needs to be the sacrificial lamb, I'll volunteer. I knew the 2 of you were falling in love, and I didn't do anything to stop it. In fact, once I realized that Giselle might consider changing her views, I encouraged it. Luke gazed at him. What views? We can talk about that later. Giselle clearly wanted to change the subject. He decided to let her do that, but he'd get back to it sometime later. He wanted to know her views and how he fit into them, or how he didn't. Nobody's to blame for this except me, Giselle said. I'm the one who chose to reveal the secret. Bryce encouraged me, but I'm the one who. What's that? Bryce walked into the room. Are you trying to pin this rap on me, little sister? Never. Giselle slipped her hand from Luke's and stood. I'm glad you urged me to tell Luke. He deserved to know. I'm grateful. Luke stood and walked over to shake Bryce's hand. This is a lot to take in, but far better for me to be on information overload than to have no information at all. And no, Giselle. Bryce nodded, his gaze understanding. Obviously I agree with that. I didn't expect Cynthia to be a part of all this, but maybe that's a good thing. She's on the inside with you now, instead of on the outside. Given how close you 2 are, I think in the long run this will make things easier. Luke regarded Bryce with new respect. Good thought. I hadn't considered that. I told Cynthia the council will probably require that she and her brother sign a non-disclosure agreement, Bryce continued. And there could be. You've been discussing this with her? Luke heard his tone of voice. Way to have a knee-jerk reaction. He backpedaled immediately. I mean, good. I'm glad you talked to her about it. Actually, I've been discussing it with him. Cynthia came up behind Bryce and peeked over his shoulder. I wasn't born yesterday, big brother. Realize we're now in the category of those who know too much, so I asked Bryce how werewolves handle a case like ours. I don't relish getting eliminated. Do you? No, I don't. He reminded himself that Cynthia's brain was always working, so naturally she'd figured out the possible consequences of this caper too. Maybe someday, 20 years from now, he'd shed the last of his protective behavior. Then again, maybe not. The way I look at it, Bryce said, Mr. Thatcher can vouch for you and Cynthia, and Benedict can add in his 2 cents, since he's known both of you for a long time too. The council could impose some monitoring for a year or so, but that might be it. Might. Luke frowned. I don't like these vague terms. Give it to me straight. What's the worst that could happen? Bryce eyed him. You mean if they decided you pose a definite security risk? Exactly. Let's say they don't trust me or Cynthia for that matter, despite what you all say. What would they do? Kill us. Bryce sighed. No, you have to get that out of your head. We don't kill. But we might need to contain you. Aha. I knew it. You'd have to catch me first though. And my little sister can run like a bat out of hell. Oh, we would catch you. But don't worry. It's not like we have a prison with a dungeon or anything. It's more like staying at the most luxurious resort in the world. As if that makes it better, Luke muttered. But it won't happen, Cynthia said. We have 3 great character references. If you'll just let me do the talking, we'll be fine. From the corner of his eye, Luke saw Giselle cover her mouth as if hiding a smile. Okay, so his little sister was cute and sassy while he was the gloom and doom guy in the bunch. But despite all the insights he'd gained recently, he couldn't turn off that basic urge to keep Cynthia safe. That had been imprinted on him when he was 10, and it wasn't changing. At this point he wasn't entirely convinced that he could keep her safe, and worry churned in his gut. I think we've beat that subject to death, Bryce said. How about a tour of the werewolf playground? That should cheer everybody up. Luke doubted it would make him any more cheerful, but he was curious. Let's do it. He gestured for Giselle to go ahead of him. She leaned toward him as she walked by. It'll be okay. I promise. Hope so. He believed she'd do everything in her power to make it so, but she couldn't possibly have complete control over what would happen. As he started to follow her, Mr. Thatcher touched his arm. He turned around and the butler motioned him closer. There is that perfect solution, the one Cynthia mentioned, he murmured. I've been thinking about that. They wouldn't marry. They would mate. The term had a primitive ring to it that both excited and alarmed him. I urge you to think about it. It's tough to get my mind around it, Mr. Thatcher. It's a radical concept. And most of all, I don't know if she would want that. Or if I do. He might have been thinking about it before, but now that he knew she was a different species, he didn't feel as if he knew her as well as he had imagined. It wasn't that he didn't love her, but knowing she was a werewolf gave him pause and made him want to know more before he made any decisions. As Chapter 27. Giselle was dying to know what Mr. Thatcher was saying to Luke, but instead of meandering and using her sharp hearing to eavesdrop, she walked briskly down the hallway to the locker room. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, which helped to block out their conversation. Luke and the butler had a long-standing relationship that had suffered a major shock. Discovering she was a werewolf had obviously been difficult for Luke to accept, but adjusting to Mr. Thatcher's new identity could be even tougher. She had no right to intrude on their discussion. When she walked through the door at the end of the hallway and entered the locker room designed for wers to store their clothes, Luke and Mr. Thatcher were still in the bar. Benedict, Bryce, and Cynthia stood waiting for her at the opposite end of the locker room, at the entrance to the playground. We wondered if you'd ever get here, Cynthia said. Of course you've seen it before, but my brother hasn't. I think he'd be dying of curiosity. Where is he? He and Mr. Thatcher are having a talk. Oh. Cynthia glanced at Giselle. Partly about you, I'll bet. I don't know. Maybe. You should have hung back to listen. I would've. Hey. Bryce pretended to be shocked. Don't forget I have to vouch for your sterling character, Missy. Don't be announcing to me that you're a habitual eavesdropper. Cynthia shrugged. I'm a little sister. We survive by eavesdropping. Am I right, Giselle? You're right, but in this case it felt wrong. What do you think they might be saying about me? Bryce traded glances with Cynthia before he faced Giselle. Probably the same thing Cynthia and I talked about while we were activating the systems. Filled her in on the new trend of werewolves mating with humans. Yeah, and I think that's awesome. Cynthia's blue eyes sparkled. You and Luke should totally do that. I've never seen him so crazy in love. So unless you hate his guts, you two should. I don't hate his guts. Giselle had to smile at that. The opposite, in fact. You love his guts? Cynthia laughed. Don't mind me. I get like this. Sometimes. Bryce laughed. Sometimes? How about 24/7? All right, so I'm a nutcase. Cynthia rolled her eyes. But seriously, Bryce. And I think you and Luke are perfect for each other, and we should know. I'm Luke's sister and Bryce is your brother. We know you two better than anybody. Giselle was impressed with the logic of that statement. It was absolutely true. That Bryce knew her better than anyone, and so far he hadn't given a thumbs up to any of the werewolves she dated. But Luke is happy here, she said. I don't want to uproot. He's not happy. Cynthia blew out a breath. He's a damned martyr. Hooking up with you would be so good for him. He needs to learn to delegate instead of carrying the whole shebang on his admittedly broad shoulders. He could even delegate to me. I thought you wanted to dance. I do and I will, but I can multitask. I wish you would take my brother up to San Francisco and make an honest man of him, Giselle. He can still be CEO down here if that floats his boat, but I favor an absentee executive if you get my drift. Eventually I'll be running this company anyway, so he can gradually get used to that. Giselle couldn't help smiling at the audacity of this 22-year-old woman. I believe you will be the CEO one day. But what about Luke? What's he destined to do with his life if you take over Dalton Industries? I see him turning into a country gentleman, maybe buying a winery in Napa, admitting he's not the type A he's trying to be here in Vegas, and being blissfully content with you in that lovely pastoral setting. Really? Giselle stared at her. I thought he liked the hustle and bustle. He thinks he should because our dad did. In case you haven't noticed, he's been trying very hard to be Angus Dalton 2.0. Giselle burst out laughing. She was still laughing when Luke and Mr. Thatcher came into the locker room. Luke gazed at her. What's so funny? Your sister. She cracks me up. Glad to hear it. Maybe she wants to do stand-up comedy instead of dancing with the moonbeams. You just gave me an idea, brother of mine. Cynthia executed a quick little soft shoe. A dancing stand-up comic. I'm going to work on that. I'll buy a ticket, Giselle said. There you go. Cynthia shot her a look of solidarity. I have my first member of the audience. You'll fill the seats, Bryce said. I'll second that, Benedict said with a grin. Guaranteed. But how about we take a stroll through the playground, now that everyone's here? Giselle nodded. Let's do that. Her heart felt lighter knowing that Bryce and Cynthia believed in a happy ever after for her and Luke. But they could believe that till the cows came home. And if Luke didn't want anything to do with werewolves, she would lose him. If so, she would let him go easily without drama. He would never know that. Her heart would be permanently broken. Cynthia and Bryce had only confirmed what she already knew. Luke was her soul mate. No other would do for her. Bryce and Cynthia went through the swinging door, designed so that a wolf could open it without difficulty. Mr. Thatcher gestured for Giselle to go next, but she hung back. After you, Mr. Thatcher. Luke and I will bring up the rear. She didn't know if he wanted to walk with her or not, but they'd had so little time to speak privately since she'd shifted into wolf form. They should give themselves a chance to talk, however it turned out. Good idea, Luke said. Before they went through the door, he took her hand. Again. She considered that a positive sign. He'd had a lot to assimilate in a short time, but obviously he wasn't ready to give her the old heave-ho, or he wouldn't have laced his fingers so securely through hers. They stepped through the door onto an overlook, and his fingers flexed. She wasn't surprised that he'd react that way. The view was breathtaking, especially considering they were underground. Cool, pine-scented air wafted up to them, along with the sound of rushing water and the hoot of an owl. A full moon shone intermittently, though clouds scudding across a starry sky. Through the artistry of the playgrounds, creators. They stood on the edge of a canyon high in the Rocky Mountains on a moonlit night. I'm heading down, Benedict said. Watch your step. This place was designed for werewolves who have excellent night vision. But if you walk carefully, you should be fine. The path is wide enough for two creatures, either were or human. Giselle took a deep breath, drawing in the wonder of the place, the same wonder she'd felt when she'd come here years ago. In the midst of a city teeming with noise, lights, and crowds, this retreat existed for the Wers who longed for an escape into a serene forest. The playground was an engineering marvel and a sanctuary for those of a different species. No wonder werewolves everywhere had mourned its loss when a human had gained possession of their special place. I can't believe this, Luke murmured. I can hear crickets. Werewolf scientists collaborated to make it as authentic as possible given the technology at the time. It's updated whenever new designs become available. As we walk along, you'll hear rustling in the leaves to simulate the movement of night creatures like raccoons and skunks. How about animatronics? Any fake birds or animals here? As I understand it, the builders decided that would be an insult to visitors. Our sense of smell would tell us immediately the creatures weren't real. The sounds provide a more convincing illusion. Makes sense now that I know more. He glanced at the winding path. The others were already several yards in front of them. Want to take a walk in the woods? I'd love to. Luke started down the incline at a leisurely pace. I like that we don't have to worry about snakes. They say Harrison Cartwright wanted to create a place where the participants didn't have to worry about anything and could simply enjoy the ambience as an anxiety-free zone, and werewolves don't have many of those. Are Cynthia and I the first humans to see it? I can't say for sure. I'd love to tell you that's true because it would make this moment even more special, but I doubt you're the first humans in here. Aiden and Rourke Wallace of the Wallace Pack each have human mates, and I have to believe at least one of those couples has been here on vacation. Is their father the one who's president of your council? He is. She brushed past a pine branch that extended into the path. Did Mr. Thatcher mention him? Her stomach tightened. This anxiety-free zone no longer was. Now they would talk about the central issue between them, the one that could bring them together or tear them apart. He did mention the guy and the situation with his two sons. It was startled to find out that werewolves and humans were mating. Yes. He pulled her to a stop on the path, a place shadowed by tall pines. Their needles carpeted the ground, and a stream flowed nearby, its rippling music adding to the sense of being deep in the midst of a wilderness. How do you feel about that? So it was out on the table, the question that had plagued her ever since she'd fallen in love with him. Her answer had been easy in the beginning. Because he hadn't known that werewolves existed, she'd vowed to keep that knowledge from him so that he'd never have to make such a painful choice. She faced him. I'll tell you the truth. I hope so. His eyes flashed in the semi-darkness. I expect no less from you. Giselle. I've never lied to you. He was quiet for a moment. I guess not. You just didn't tell me everything. Now I want to know it all, beginning with how you stand on this mating business. I've always been firmly opposed to it. He exhaled. Then why did you tell me? Why did you make it seem as if you wanted to be with me no matter what the difficulties might be? I don't. I was against it until I met you. The silence stretched between them. Finally he spoke, his voice strained. And now the dam broke and her tears flowed. Oh, Luke, I've tried to give you up, but every time I think of living without you, it's as if this big black hole is swallowing me, and I can't. I can't. Me either, he said softly. Me either, my love. And he pulled her close, tucked her head under his chin, and rocked her back and forth as she cried. But I'm asking you to change everything. He chuckled. Everything changed the minute you walked into my office, demanding to know what information I had on our rebellious siblings. I haven't been the same since. But I'm a werewolf, Luke. That means if we have offspring they could be human or were. Can you live with that? Now he was totally confused. I thought you couldn't have kids. I can have them. I just can't get pregnant until I'm mated to someone. It's a weird thing. But you and I could have offspring. They'd just be mixed. Could you deal with that? He hesitated for a brief second. Look, if you can't, I respect that, Luke. I completely understand. Hang on, Giselle. I can absolutely deal with that. It's a startling concept, especially after I'd thought you couldn't have kids, but the one thing I can't live with is being separated from you. So there you have it. You'll have time to think about these things. I'm not demanding your answer. Now, she was determined to get everything out in the open. Here's another issue. I'll want to shift now and then and run through the woods. Will that gross you out when I do it? Nope. I'm sort of jealous, if you must know. And by the way, demonstrating that ability was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen in my life. He kissed the top of her head. What if I'd freaked out and called 911? What if I'd tried to kill you? I trusted you. I knew you wouldn't harm me. Exactly. He pulled her closer. Just as I trust you and know you'd never harm me either. I can't imagine what mating with a werewolf means really, but if the alternative is giving you up forever, the choice is ridiculously easy. She hugged him tight. Mating with me means you won't have to be locked inside that resort-style prison. That's good to know. I wasn't too pleased with that scenario. And Cynthia will have privileged status as your sister, so unless she starts acting crazy as if she's about to broadcast our presence to the world, she'll have complete freedom of movement. His muscles relaxed and he sighed. Good. That's so good. I can be very happy knowing that my sister will be okay. She'll be okay whether we mate or not. Giselle lifted her head to gaze up at him. Don't make that the deciding factor, Luke. No matter what happens between us, I will fight for Cynthia with all I have. So will Bryce. So will Mr. Thatcher. She has champions among us. She's well protected. The shadows hid his expression, but his warmth radiated around her. You would fight for her, wouldn't you? Damn straight I would. I'm loyal to you, and that means I'm loyal to your sister. Werewolves have a very strong sense of family. Besides, she's a kick. I really like her. She likes you too. He gathered her close and gazed down at her. She asked if I believed in soulmates. I said I didn't know. She told me if there was such a thing, you were mine. Her breath stalled. And what do you think? I think she's onto something. He leaned down, his mouth nearly touching hers. Will you be my mate, Giselle? My soulmate. She was like a balloon full of helium ready to fly, but she didn't want to leave this place, this man, this moment. Yes, she whispered. Because you. See, I already am. Not long afterward, while Luke was in the midst of a deep kiss that would inevitably lead to more than a kiss, he became aware of approaching footsteps. Apparently the rest of the party had finished exploring the playground and were walking back up the path. Then the footsteps stopped, as if all four had realized they'd come upon an intimate scene, one they didn't want to interrupt. Luke stopped kissing Giselle long enough to turn his head and hold out his hand. Whoever has the remote to that revolving wall, give it to me, please. Right on. Seconds later, Benedict placed the remote into Luke's outstretched palm. Don't lose it, dude. Thanks. I won't. Luke shoved it in his jeans pocket. We might be a while. You can all go home. Don't forget to close up, Benedict added. We won't. Giselle promised from the depths of her sweetheart's embrace. Yeah, like she's really focused on that, Bryce said. Not. Luke chuckled. Don't worry, Bryce. I'm the responsible type. Ask my sister. And besides, I still own the place. See you all in the morning. Then he went back to kissing the love of his life, who also happened to be a werewolf. As he was beginning to understand, that was going to make this love affair one hell of an adventure, and it would begin now very aptly in the middle of a make-believe forest.